Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. We're taking a close look today at a really fascinating and complex topic. This is based on sources you provided. Specifically, we're looking at a legal analysis from Quorum 24. It digs right into the situation between Somalia and the claims of secession by Somaliland.
Yeah, and this particular source, it takes a very clear stance. It's arguing from a legal and constitutional perspective.
Okay.
Its main point that Somalia's unity is, well, legally intact, both under its own laws and international law. And that means, from this viewpoint, Somaliland is legally still part of Somalia.
Right. So our mission here is to really get into the arguments this specific source is making. We want to understand its viewpoint, see the legal reasoning it uses to say, look, Somalia's unity holds up, legally speaking, even with that unilateral independence claim from Hargeisa.
Exactly. We'll be pulling out the core legal points, the historical details it uses, basically distilling this analysis so you can quickly grasp this specific perspective on what is, let's face it, a very intricate issue.
Okay, so diving in, where does this source begin building its case for unity? What's the foundation?
It starts right at the beginning, July 1st, 1960, the Union. It talks about the unification of British Somaliland and the trust territory of Somalia forming the Somali Republic.
Yeah.
And it presents this initial act as, reflecting the mutual will of both sides at the time.
But the source is pretty upfront about some initial, let's say, bumps in the road. It mentions procedural flaws in that first act of union.
It absolutely does. Yeah, things like two different texts of the act, no single treaty properly deposited. It acknowledges those points.
Okay.
But then it brings in what it sees as the crucial counterpoint to those early sort of procedural snags.
Yeah.
And that's the 1961 constitutional referendum.
Ah, okay, yeah. This is where it gets really interesting, doesn't it? Because this wasn't just a regional vote. The source stresses it was held across the entire new Somali Republic.
That's completely key to its argument, yeah. It points to the statistic. Over 90% of voters nationwide approved the new constitution.
Yeah.
And critically, that constitution explicitly codified the union, made it law.
Now, the source does mention lower turnout in parts of the North. How does it deal with that detail?
It acknowledges it, yes. But its conclusion, the way it frames it, is that the national popular mandate from that referendum is what truly validated the union. Its view is essentially that this widespread democratic approval fulfilled the legal requirements for consolidating the state. It sort of cured those earlier procedural problems, especially under international law.
So the legal interpretation here is that the popular vote basically gave the union democratic legitimacy and fixed those initial legislative hiccups.
Precisely. That's the core of it. The analysis suggests popular constitutional ratification is, like, a legal mechanism to overcome earlier procedural flaws.
Right.
And then it follows that up by arguing, look, the state kept functioning as one entity until the civil conflict started. And importantly, it argues that conflict, while obviously disruptive, didn't legally sever the state's continuity.
And the source really tackles that ratification question directly, too, doesn't it? The argument that maybe the original act wasn't perfectly ratified in one single document. How does it push back on that?
It lays out three main points. First, it circles back to that 61 referendum again. The people confirmed the union by voting for the Constitution. That's point one.
Right, connecting the popular will directly to the legal status. Okay, what's number two?
Second, it points to the practical reality on the ground. Government institutions from both North and South actually merged. They operated as a single sovereign state for decades. This sustained state practice, it argues, is powerful evidence of a real functioning union.
Makes sense. And the third pillar for this specific counter-argument?
The third point is that there was no formal legal withdrawal, no nullification of the union by either side in any legal sense at any point before 1991. Basically, no legal divorce proceedings ever took place back then.
So putting those together, the referendum, the integrated government, the lack of any formal split, what's the main takeaway the source wants us to get on that ratification challenge?
The analysis really emphasizes that in both domestic and international law, the demonstrated will of the people through the referendum, plus decades of unified state practice. Well, that's seen as legally outweighing those initial technical issues with the legislation. Substance over form, basically.
That flows quite naturally into another big principle the source really leans on, territorial integrity in international law.
Yes, this is presented as absolutely fundamental, a bedrock principle.
Oh.
The source argues that under customary international law, and specifically citing the UN Charter Article 2.4, the territorial integrity of existing states is paramount.
And within that framework, how does the source view unilateral secession? One part just declaring independence without agreement?
It's quite firm on this. The source argues that unilateral secession is generally not permitted under international law. Full stop. Except, it notes, in very specific, very narrow circumstances.
Okay, and what are those narrow exceptions it lists?
It mentions situations like classic colonial rule, foreign occupation, or perhaps cases of really persistent gray human rights violations, where there's absolutely no recourse, no way to address them within the existing state.
So how does the source apply that strict standard to Somaliland's claim?
Well, it argues directly that Somaliland's situation just doesn't meet any of those criteria. Its reasoning is Somaliland wasn't colonized by the rest of Somalia. It hasn't faced that kind of sustained oppression post-1991. And crucially, it points out that Somalia now has a federal constitution, which, according to the source, provides a framework for regional autonomy. So there is recourse short of breaking away.
Okay, and the source doesn't just stick to general principles. It brings in specific treaties, legal precedents. Let's talk about the Montevideo Convention first.
Right. The source anticipates the argument. It says, look, those advocating for Somaliland might say it does meet Montevideo's criteria for statehood.
You mean like defined territory, permanent population, government capacity for international relations, that stuff?
Exactly those. But, and this is the critical counterpoint from the source, meeting those criteria might be necessary, but it's not sufficient. What's missing, it argues, is recognition, especially recognition by the parent state, Somalia in this case. Without that, the claim to statehood remains legally incomplete, according to this view.
And it uses a specific court case to kind of hammer this point home about recognition.
It does. It brings up the International Court of Justice's 2010 advisory opinion on Kosovo. The source uses that case to support its argument that simply declaring independence doesn't automatically create lawful statehood if you don't have recognition, and implicitly, the consent or at least acquiescence of the state you're separating from.
Okay, shifting focus a bit. Within Africa itself, the source mentions the African Union Constitutive Act. What's the relevant bit there?
It highlights Article 4B. This article strongly enshrines the principle of respecting borders as they existed at the time of independence. It's often called Udi Possidetis Juris. Basically, keep the borders you inherited.
And how does the source connect that principle to Somalia?
According to this analysis, Udi Possidetis Juris means respecting the borders of the Somali Republic as it was formed in 1960. And that, the source argues, includes the territory of former British Somaliland, because both territories voluntarily joined to create that single state back then. Their independence moment was joining together.
And what about the AU's actual position, as presented by the source? Has the AU weighed in?
The source definitely brings this up. It points out that the AU's Peace and Security Council looked into this. They even had a fact-finding mission to Somaliland back in 2005, and the outcome. The source says the AU declined to support recognition. It attributes this refusal to the AU's commitment to preserving the unity of existing member states and a fear of setting a precedent, creating a domino effect of secession claims across Africa.
Interesting. So moving beyond just the legal texts, the source also looks at the history, specifically the political participation of people from the northern regions within the unified Somali government.
Yes, exactly. The source uses this as another line of argument. It suggests that the historical and even current presence of high-level officials from the north within the federal Somali government kind of undermines the idea of a complete separation, legally or politically.
Can you give us those specific examples the source uses?
Sure. It highlights prominent figures like Mohammed Haji Ibrahim Ogal and Omar Arta-Khalib, both who are from Somaliland, and both served as prime ministers of the Somali Republic during periods when the country was unified.
And it brings us right up to the present day, too.
It does, yeah. It notes that Abdi Hashi Abdullahi, who is also from Somaliland, currently holds a very significant position. He's the Speaker of the Senate in Somalia's federal government right now.
So what's the overall point the source is making with this history of participation? What conclusion does it draw?
The source basically argues that this consistent, high-level involvement shows that elites from the northern regions have historically recognized and operated within the Somali state structure, even benefiting from it. And that, it suggests, weakens the claims of a complete break or a total lack of acceptance of the unified state over the decades.
Okay, so given this legal framework the source lays out, arguing against unilateral secession, what path forward does it propose from its legal standpoint?
Well, the analysis strongly points towards federalism. It presents federalism as the legitimate constitutional alternative to fragmentation.
And what's the basis for proposing federalism, according to the source?
It anchors this in Somalia's 2012 provisional constitution. The source sees this document as providing a valid, existing legal framework for federal governance across the entire territory, including Somaliland.
And what does the source say this federal structure actually offers? Why is it the proposed solution?
The source argues it offers a way for regions, Somaliland included, to have significant autonomy, real devolved powers. But, and this is the key part for the source, while preserving the overall national unity and the legal continuity of the Somali state.
And it tries to frame this approach as being in line with how things are done elsewhere, like global norms.
Yes, it does position it that way. It suggests that this model decentralization within a unified state aligns with international trends that encourage inclusion, regional self-governance, but without resorting to state disintegration.
And didn't the source use some comparisons to other countries to make this point?
It did, yeah. It brings up cases like Canada and Quebec, Spain and Catalonia, and even the history of Ethiopia and Eritrea's separation, though that's a bit different. But it uses these examples mainly to illustrate its point that unilateral secession usually isn't recognized internationally unless there's mutual agreement, maybe a clear court ruling, or it fits those very rare extreme conditions we talked about earlier. Conditions which, the source maintains, just don't apply in Somaliland, the case.
Okay, so pulling all these different threads together now, the history of the Union, the legal principles, the treaties, participation, the proposed federal path, what is the source's final verdict? Its bottom line on the legal status of Somaliland.
The source's conclusion is pretty unambiguous. It frames the evidence, legal, political, diplomatic, as it presents it as overwhelmingly pointing toward the continued unity of Somalia.
Okay, let's just quickly recap those key pieces of evidence one last time, according to the source.
Sure. The source argues, 1, the 1960 Union, despite maybe a rocky start procedurally, got its democratic legitimacy from the '61 nationwide referendum. 2, people from Somaliland have consistently participated at the highest levels of Somali government, historically and currently. 3, no major international body, no treaty organization has recognized Somaliland's unilateral secession claim. And 4, the big international and regional legal frameworks, UN Charter, AU principles, ICJ, think they strongly back territorial integrity and generally oppose unilateral splits.
And so the source's final conclusive statement based on all that analysis is?
According to this specific legal analysis we've been discussing, until there's some kind of agreed political solution reached through constitutional processes and mutual consent between everyone involved, Somaliland remains, legally and factually, a part of the Federal Republic of Somalia. That's the clear position presented in this material in the eyes of international law and, it argues, the world.
And that wraps up our deep dive into this specific legal perspective presented in the source material you shared with us. We've walked through its arguments, the evidence it musters, all leading to its conclusion that, from its viewpoint, Somalia's unity remains legally intact.
Yeah, we've really tried to distill the specific details and the line of reasoning used in that analysis, give you a direct look into one particular legal take on this very complex and often debated situation.
So, given the source's strong, almost strict emphasis on legal status and international norms, here's something maybe to think about as you reflect on this. What happens, or what kind of tensions arise, when the reality on the ground, the political situation, maybe popular feelings in a region, seem to diverge pretty significantly from the kind of formal legal framework that a source like this describes?
That's a really fascinating question, isn't it? It highlights that potential gap between legal arguments, however strong they might be on paper, and the lived political reality. Definitely something worth mulling over.